My grandkids tried to take everything. So I walked into court and took it all back. They went pale. The last thing I ever thought I'd hear from my own grandson was, "She's too old to fight us. Let her sign it over." But he said it, smirking, right across my kitchen table. My name is Eleanor Fisher. I'm 73 years old, and I've lived in the same house in Richmond, Virginia, for more than 40 years. It's a modest brick ranch, the place where my late husband and I raised our children, and where my grandchildren learned to walk, to read, to become their own people. Or so I believed. I never imagined the same children I once rocked to sleep would look me in the eye and tell me I was an obstacle, something to be pushed aside so they could get what they wanted faster. It started after my daughter Melanie passed unexpectedly last year. She was only 52. Her death shattered me. Losing a child isn't something you recover from. I thought my grandkids, Emma and Kyle, would want to keep our family close in the aftermath. But in the months after the funeral, something shifted. They started coming around more often, but not to check on me. No, they had other plans. Emma is 30, with a sleek ponytail and a voice that drips with forced sweetness when she wants something. Kyle is 28, the kind of young man who thinks he knows everything because he reads a few articles online. The first time I noticed their visits were less about me and more about what I had, I tried to pretend otherwise. Maybe they just didn't know how to process their mother's death. Maybe they needed time. But that afternoon in my kitchen, when I laid out the apple pie I'd baked just to see their faces light up, I caught them exchanging a glance I'll never forget. Like I was a nuisance, an inconvenience standing between them and the inheritance they believed was theirs by birthright. "I'm not ready to talk about the house," I told them when they slid the papers across the table. Kyle didn't even look up. Emma folded her arms and said in a clipped tone, "Grandma, be reasonable. You can't take care of this place anymore. If you sign now, you'll still get to live here. Until, you know." She trailed off like she couldn't be bothered to say "until you die." I felt something in me snap. I had given everything I had to my family, my time, my energy, my money. When my husband passed, I kept our home from foreclosure by working extra shifts at the library, even though I was in my 60s. I paid for Emma's college tuition when her father said he couldn't. I helped Kyle start a small lawn business when he was floundering. And here they were, ready to take it all because they assumed I was too tired to resist. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. My knees ached, but I didn't care. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice shaking. That was when Kyle laughed, not a little embarrassed chuckle, a loud, dismissive bark that made my cheeks burn with humiliation. "She'll never stand up to us," he said, as if I wasn't even in the room. "Let her think she has a choice." I knew in that moment I had two options. I could crumble and let them strip away the last piece of my life that was truly mine. Or I could do what I had done my whole life, even when everyone underestimated me. I could fight. So I swallowed my fear, lifted my chin, and said, "You'll get nothing from me. Not now, not ever." I wish I could tell you they backed down, that they apologized. But that's not how this story goes. Within a week, I received notice that they had filed a petition in probate court to contest the deed, claiming I was no longer mentally competent to manage my own property. I had never felt so betrayed, but I also had never been more certain of what I needed to do. This was no longer just about the house. It was about my dignity, my legacy, and the principle that you don't get to treat people like they're disposable just because you think they're too old to fight back. I was about to show them exactly what 73 years of quiet strength could do. The envelope was thin, but when I held it in my hands, it felt heavier than any burden I'd carried in my life. Official court documents. My own grandchildren, the children of my only daughter, were trying to have me declared incompetent so they could seize control of everything I owned. I sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour, the papers unopened beside my cold cup of tea. Every time I reached for them, my hands trembled. You see, I was never the kind of woman who liked conflict. When my husband Robert was alive, he handled all the big decisions. After he passed, I learned how to keep the house going, how to pay the bills and manage the insurance, but I never imagined I'd be standing alone against my own family. Finally, I took a breath, opened the envelope, and read every word. They were alleging that I was no longer of sound mind, that grief and age had left me unable to make reasonable financial decisions. They even included statements from two of their friends, claiming they'd seen me confused and struggling to remember basic information. I wanted to scream. Of course I was grieving. I had buried my daughter less than a year ago. Yes, I had days when my memory felt soft around the edges. But I wasn't incompetent, and I certainly wasn't ready to be stripped of my rights like a child. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the times I'd read them bedtime stories, how Emma used to call me her safe place, how Kyle once cried when he scraped his knee, and only I could soothe him. I thought about calling them, begging them to reconsider. Maybe if I just explained how much this was hurting me. Maybe if I reminded them who I was to them. But something in me had hardened. When dawn came, I knew exactly what I had to do. I pulled out the old shoebox from the hall closet where I kept our important papers, the deed to the house, the will Robert and I had signed, my medical records, and the letters my doctor had written last spring, affirming I was still fully capable of managing my affairs. I laid them all out on the table, one by one, like ammunition. Then I called an attorney. Her name was Natalie Perez. She was in her 40s, sharp as a tack, and came highly recommended by one of the women at my church. When I explained everything, my voice breaking as I recounted Kyle's laughter and Emma's cold eyes, she didn't try to placate me or suggest I back down. "Mrs. Fisher," she said firmly, "they are counting on you to be too intimidated to fight this. But you have more rights than you think, and more evidence than they realize. If you want to challenge this, I will stand with you." Something inside me steadied. I wasn't alone anymore. Over the next 2 weeks, Natalie and I built a case. She gathered sworn statements from my neighbors, my doctor, and my pastor, people who knew me and could speak to my mental clarity. She combed through my bank records and utility bills to show I had been managing everything without incident. She even had me undergo an independent medical evaluation to prove I was perfectly capable. Still, each time I thought of facing Emma and Kyle in court, my stomach twisted. Would they look me in the eye? Would they feel even an ounce of shame? The night before the first hearing, I walked through each room of my house, running my hands over the photos on the walls, pictures of Robert holding our babies, Melanie in her graduation gown, even Emma and Kyle as toddlers grinning with cake on their cheeks. I stood there in the living room clutching a frame to my chest and whispered, "Robert, if you can hear me, give me the strength to see this through." The next morning, I dressed carefully, a navy suit I hadn't worn since Robert's funeral, and pinned my mother's old brooch at my collar. When I stepped out my front door, I wasn't just Eleanor Fisher, the old woman my grandchildren thought they could steamroll. I was a woman who had survived loss, who had held a family together for decades, who was about to walk into court and fight for every single thing she'd earned. And I was ready. The courthouse in Richmond was a place I had only visited once before, years ago, when Robert and I had filed some paperwork about our wills. Back then, it had felt like just another formality, a way to tidy up the edges of a life we built together. But walking through those double glass doors that morning, I felt like a defendant in a crime I hadn't committed. Every eye seemed to linger on me a beat too long, as though they could sense the family drama trailing in behind me. Natalie met me at the security line. She was calm, her navy pantsuit crisp, her folder thick with evidence. She squeezed my hand once before leading me into the courtroom itself. It was smaller than I expected, just 2 rows of benches on either side, the judge's bench rising modestly at the front. But when I saw Emma and Kyle already seated at the petitioner's table, all the air seemed to leave my body. They looked so polished. Emma in a tailored gray dress, Kyle in a dark suit and tie I'd never seen him wear. They didn't look at me, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge me at all. It was as if I'd already disappeared from their lives. I sat down beside Natalie, trying to keep my face neutral. Inside, I was trembling. The judge, a woman named Judge Holloway, entered. She looked to be in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled into a neat twist. Her expression was unreadable as she scanned the documents before her. The bailiff called the case, "In the matter of the competency of Eleanor May Fisher." Hearing my full name announced like that, like I was some fragile relic, sparked something hot and defiant inside me. Natalie rose to introduce herself, and the proceedings began. First, their attorney laid out their claims, that I was mentally unfit, that I had been making erratic decisions, that my confusion endangered the security of the property. I could hardly believe the words as he spoke them, so smooth, so certain. He presented the statements from Emma's friend and Kyle's former co-worker, people I barely knew. They testified I had trouble recalling dates and seemed disoriented during brief interactions. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. Then it was Natalie's turn. She stood tall, her voice clear as a bell. "Your Honor, these are opinions, not facts. We will show not only that Mrs. Fisher is competent, but that she has been the target of undue influence and manipulation." When Natalie called my doctor as the first witness, I could have wept with relief. He testified to my good health, my clear cognition, and my steady routines. Next came my neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, who told the court she'd seen me mowing my own lawn, handling my mail, and balancing my checkbook without issue. Each voice in my defense steadied me, layer by layer. But the hardest moment came when the judge addressed me directly. "Mrs. Fisher," she said gently, "do you understand why you're here today?" I swallowed, wishing my throat wasn't so tight. "Yes, Your Honor. My grandchildren believe I can't care for myself or my home. But they're wrong. I may be old, I may be grieving, but I am not incompetent." Emma shifted uncomfortably. Kyle looked away. "And do you understand what will happen if the court rules against you?" the judge asked. My voice didn't shake this time. "They will control everything I have, my house, my finances, my decisions. I will be a guest in my own life." A hush fell over the courtroom. When the lunch recess was called, I stepped into the hallway, feeling like I'd run a marathon. Natalie and I sat together on a wooden bench. "You're doing beautifully," she said. "No matter how this ends, you've already shown them you won't be bullied." For a moment, I closed my eyes. I thought about Robert's hand on mine, the way he used to tell me I was stronger than I believed. He would be proud of me today. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. There were still hours left to argue, more statements, more cross-examinations, and if they thought I would crumble before it was done, they had learned nothing at all. When we returned to the courtroom after lunch, I felt strangely calm. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the realization that there was nothing left to hide, nothing left to lose. I had already been humiliated and underestimated by the very people I loved most. Whatever happened next, they could not take my dignity from me without my permission. Natalie opened her folder and began presenting evidence that contradicted everything Emma and Kyle had claimed. First, she showed the court my bank statements, meticulously balanced, every bill paid on time. She presented the notarized letter from my doctor confirming I had no diagnosis of dementia or any other cognitive impairment. Then she produced receipts, proving I had personally handled the renewal of my homeowner's insurance, the property taxes, and the maintenance contracts for the house. I watched as Emma's expression grew tight, her eyes darting from the paperwork to the judge. But Natalie wasn't finished. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but polite, "I'd also like to submit these text messages into evidence." She handed the bailiff a packet of printed pages, which he brought up to Judge Holloway. I hadn't seen them before. Natalie glanced at me, her eyebrows lifting as if to say, "Trust me." The judge read silently for what felt like hours. Then she looked up. "Ms. Perez, can you summarize what these messages contain?" "Yes, Your Honor," Natalie replied. "These are text exchanges between the petitioners, Emma and Kyle Fisher. In them, they discuss encouraging Mrs. Fisher to just sign everything over before she gets too suspicious." They also mention using the grief angle to pressure her into a guardianship arrangement. The air left the room. Emma's mouth fell open. Kyle went pale. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the judge turned to them. Miss Fisher? Mr. Fisher? Would you care to respond to these communications? Emma swallowed visibly. Those were private messages. We were frustrated. It doesn't mean... Doesn't mean what? Judge Holloway interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp. That you were deliberately plotting to take advantage of your grandmother's grief? Kyle cleared his throat, but said nothing. I felt no triumph in that moment, only sorrow. This was my family, the children of my daughter, who I'd loved more than life. Seeing them exposed like that, their schemes laid bare for strangers to dissect, was a kind of heartbreak I hadn't known was possible. Natalie touched my elbow lightly. Stay strong, she murmured. The judge called for a brief recess so she could review everything. I walked slowly to the hallway and sat on the same bench where I'd waited that morning. My legs felt numb. My heart ached. I thought of Melanie, how ashamed she would have been to see her children behaving like this, how furious she would have been that they used her death as leverage. I closed my eyes and tried to remember something good. One Christmas, when Emma was 6 and Kyle 4, they had made me a necklace from macaroni and string. They'd wrapped it in tissue paper and waited all morning for me to open it. Do you like it, Grandma? Emma had asked, her eyes so wide and hopeful. I love it, I told her. And I had. How did we end up here? When the bailiff called us back in, I felt something inside me settle. Whatever happened next, I had faced the truth without flinching. I had fought with everything I had left. The judge looked at each of us in turn as she spoke. I have reviewed all evidence and testimony, she began. It is clear to me that Mrs. Fisher is competent and capable of managing her affairs. My breath caught. Furthermore, she continued, the petition appears to have been filed in bad faith, with the intent to exert undue influence over Mrs. Fisher's property. Emma let out a small, strangled gasp. Kyle's hands were clenched tight in his lap. The judge set the papers aside. I am dismissing this petition in full. Mrs. Fisher retains all rights and control over her estate. Additionally, I will be referring this matter to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office for further review, should there be evidence of attempted exploitation. The courtroom was silent. I closed my eyes, feeling a single tear slip down my cheek. Not because I had won, but because I was finally free of the fear that had been crushing me since the day they slid that paper across my kitchen table. Natalie leaned over and whispered, You did it. I nodded, unable to speak. Yes, I had done it. When the hearing ended, I stood slowly, feeling every one of my 73 years. My knees ached, my back throbbed, but I held my head high. Emma and Kyle remained seated, neither looking at me. I wished I could say I felt anger, but the truth was, all I felt was a deep, marrow-deep sadness. This was the price of standing up for myself, the final unraveling of the family I'd loved with my whole heart. Natalie gathered her files and touched my arm. If you're ready, I'll walk you out. We stepped into the bright Virginia sun. The day was warm and golden, and it struck me as painfully ironic. Such a beautiful afternoon, and yet I felt like something had died inside me. On the courthouse steps, Natalie turned to me. You understand, Mrs. Fisher, that the judge's dismissal doesn't erase the damage they tried to do. The referral to the Commonwealth Attorney means they could be investigated further. I nodded. I understand, but I'm not interested in revenge. Even so, she said carefully, it's possible you'll be contacted for additional statements. I'll be with you every step of the way if that happens. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. She offered to drive me home, but I refused. I needed the quiet of my own company. I needed to feel my hands on the steering wheel, to remind myself I was still in control of my life. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, watching the sun slant across the porch. My house, my sanctuary, looked just the same as it always had, but it felt different now, like it had been defended, reclaimed. Inside, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. I thought about everything that had brought me to this day, the years of sacrifice, the birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays I had given to Emma and Kyle without a second thought. I thought about the woman I had been, quiet, accommodating, afraid to be seen as difficult. And then I thought about the woman who had walked into that courtroom. For the first time in my life, I realized they were not the same person. The phone rang just before dinner time. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me I already knew who it was. I let it go to voicemail. An hour later, the same number called again, then a third time. Finally, I pressed the button and held the phone to my ear. Grandma? It was Emma's voice, thin and unsteady. We didn't mean for it to go this far. We thought you'd just sign the papers. I closed my eyes. Her words sounded so small now, so pitiful. Emma, I said, my voice quiet but firm, you tried to take my life out from under me. You lied. You humiliated me in court. I don't know how we come back from that. There was a long silence. Can we talk? Face to face? She whispered. She started to cry. I almost hung up. Almost. But something in me needed to say this last thing. I love you, I told her, my throat thick, but I won't be your victim. I ended the call and set the phone down carefully. Outside, the porch light flickered on as the evening settled in. The house was quiet, only the tick of the clock and the soft hum of the refrigerator. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt safe in my own home. I knew that tomorrow might bring more phone calls, maybe apologies, maybe more excuses. But tonight, I didn't owe anyone anything. Not my forgiveness, not my understanding, not my silence, just myself, finally unafraid. The days that followed were filled with a quiet I hadn't known in years. No unexpected knocks at the door, no voices arguing in my kitchen, no papers shoved across my table demanding my compliance. Just me. And in that stillness, I began to rediscover parts of myself I'd buried beneath decades of obligation and fear. The first morning after the hearing, I woke up before dawn and sat on the porch with my tea, watching the world slowly brighten. For so long, I'd thought I needed the noise of family to feel alive, but here, with nothing but the sound of cicadas and the rustle of the oak trees, I realized I was still here, still whole. A few neighbors stopped by over the next week. Mrs. Callahan brought over a pie, her eyes kind but cautious. You did the right thing, she told me. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for standing up for yourself. I thanked her, though a part of me still struggled to accept that this was true, that defending myself wasn't the same thing as betraying them. A letter came in the mail from the Commonwealth Attorney's office. They were opening an inquiry into Emma and Kyle's petition, citing potential elder exploitation. Natalie called me right away, her voice steady and professional. I know this feels heavy, she said, but it isn't your burden to carry anymore. You told the truth. You protected yourself. Let them answer for their actions. I took her advice to heart. Instead of dwelling on the possible investigation, I turned my attention back to my home. I hired a handyman to fix the sagging front steps Robert had always meant to repair. I had the shutters painted blue, the color I'd always loved but never chosen because someone else didn't care for it. I pulled old quilts from the cedar chest and draped them over the backs of chairs, rearranged the living room, bought fresh flowers every Sunday, just because I could. Little by little, the house began to feel like mine again. Not just a museum to all I'd lost, but a place alive with my choices, my joy. I knew eventually I would have to face Emma and Kyle. We were family, no matter how frayed the bond had become. But I also knew that when that day came, I would meet them not as the meek grandmother they expected, but as a woman who had defended her life, her independence, and her right to be respected. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the hearing, I got a letter from Emma. The envelope was thick, her handwriting careful. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down, feeling my heart beat hard in my chest. It was an apology. She said she was ashamed. that she and Kyle had convinced themselves it was the only way to secure the future, that they'd told themselves I would never fight back because it would be easier for everyone. Her words were heavy with regret. She said she understood if I couldn't forgive her. I read the letter twice, then I folded it and set it aside. I wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because what they had done wasn't a simple mistake. It was a choice, and choices have consequences. But in that moment, something loosened inside me. I realized that whether or not I ever reconciled with them, I had already reclaimed the thing they tried hardest to take, my sense of worth. The phone didn't ring that evening. There were no knocks at the door. I went to bed with the windows open, the summer breeze carrying the scent of honeysuckle into my room. And as I lay there, listening to the gentle creak of the house settling around me, I knew that for the first time in a long, long while, I was finally free. In the weeks that followed, I began to understand that survival isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet insistence that you matter, even when people you love try to convince you otherwise. I started doing little things for myself, things that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations. I joined a book club at the library. The first meeting was awkward. I was the oldest woman there by a good 20 years, but before long, I was laughing along with the others, debating endings, and recommending old favorites. I started taking walks every morning before the sun got too hot, making a point to greet every neighbor. Some had read about my case in the local paper. A few offered hesitant words of sympathy, others quiet respect. I accepted them all graciously, but I didn't linger on anyone's judgment anymore. One Saturday, I drove out to the cemetery with a fresh bouquet of daisies and sat by Melanie's grave for nearly an hour. I told her everything, about the court, about the lies, about how terrified I'd been. And then, about how I had stood up, even when my hands were shaking and my voice felt too small. I imagined her smiling at me, the way she did when she was little and proud of herself for something simple and brave. That night when I came home, I found another letter from Emma. This one was shorter. Grandma, I understand you can't forgive us yet, but I hope someday you will. I'm sorry. There was no expectation in her words, no plea for reconciliation, just the simple acknowledgement that she had done harm and that she was willing to wait in the quiet, if that's what it took. I tucked the letter into a drawer. I still didn't know what to say, and that was okay. Healing doesn't happen on someone else's timeline. I spent the rest of the summer reclaiming small joys, baking bread in the afternoons, sorting old photographs, planting marigolds along the back fence. I called Natalie once more, not for legal help, but to thank her for showing me that standing up for yourself doesn't mean you have to stand alone. She told me she'd had other clients in my situation, but none who fought with such dignity. I hung up feeling lighter. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to end up in a courtroom battle with my own grandchildren. But life has a way of stripping away the illusions we cling to, of showing us what we're really made of when everything we counted on falls apart. One evening, as the first leaves began to turn gold on the oaks lining my street, I sat on my porch and watched the neighborhood settle into twilight. I thought about the woman I had been before all this, the grandmother who would have signed anything just to keep the peace, the woman who had believed that love always meant sacrifice, that silence was the price of harmony. And then I thought about the woman I was now. I was still kind, still generous, but I was no longer willing to disappear for anyone. When the neighbors walked by, they waved, and I waved back. Not the brittle, uncertain wave of someone trying to earn her place, but the steady, quiet greeting of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Because in the end, that's what this fight had been about. Not money, not property. It was about the right to stand in my own life and say, "This is mine. This is me, and I will not be moved."